All right. Welcome to our third class mailbag. I'm Peter Castor, your host of Moving Pictures That Move You. And apparently this week, most of you were moved by cargo. Let's start off with a question from Fernando. When it comes to mise-en-scène, can films with computer graphics and other forms of visual effects also be considered part of that mise-en-scène? Absolutely. I want to focus here specifically on animation, whether animation in the form of conventional hand-drawn, though even hand-drawn since The Lion King has featured extensive computer graphics as well, and even the Beauty and the Beast, the first animated film to be nominated for a Best Picture award, used computer modeling to simulate the movement of a camera through the ballroom for the famous Tale as Old as Time dance sequence. But in the case of both conventional animation and CGI animation, since Toy Story, but moving into films like Finding Nemo, Monsters, Inc., Up, WALL-E, certainly, absolutely, those are all demonstrate mise-en-scène. Mise-en-scène, of course, is the composition of objects within the frame, the interplay of light, camera angle, and movement to depict the scene in a particular way. Now, of course, the distinction is when we have a camera pointing at actors and objects in a scene, they're actually there, and their there-ness is captured, though it's transformed from its three dimensions in existence to a simulated three-dimensional space projected as two dimensions. In contrast, CGI and conventionally hand-drawn animation are constructed on a two-dimensional canvas designed to simulate three dimensions. So the earliest advance into simulating that three-dimensional space was the multiplane camera developed at Disney Studios and used in the first feature-length animation film Snow White. The multiplane camera allowed multiple cells, typically set up vertically, with a camera above them pointing down, and that way there could be one cell, below that another cell, below that another cell. These are animation cells, CEL, short for celluloid, with a separate drawing on each one, so it would simulate, in a sense, depth, though still, of course, the animation of the time demonstrated a significant degree of flatness. Now we can contrast that with a much more recent film. I'm going to focus here on, I think it's Monsters University, the sequel to Monsters, Inc., wherein every thread of the monster character has to be simulated and rendered, and using computer technology, artists would not, on the computer screen, draw every thread, but would draw and then develop software that would project them, map them, continue them, to the extent that the monsters have, at times, over 1 million threads that all wave independently in accordance with the simulation of physics. I'm more familiar with a prior film, Finding Nemo, which was a big step forward, and probably some of you were babysat by Finding Nemo as children. And as light comes into the water and refracts, as we look up and we see that light streaming through the flowing surface, that was a huge advance in animation technology. And it absolutely is mise-en-scène, though in this case, rather than the interplay of projected light onto actual objects, we have to simulate that, though that effort to simulate it was precisely so that it would seem realistic. There's not that much difference, though, in that a conventionally shot live-action film still demonstrates a massive degree of control in choosing where to project the light, how to project the light. So they're both mise-en-scène and they're both constructed, though the degree of construction differs substantially. Next up, from Jonathan, how complicated can the costume design become for a production designer when the movie spans across different times and eras, such as Westworld or the Assassin's Creed movie? It becomes extensive. And this is actually something that films of other sorts do. The Matrix has to do this not so much, well, with costumes to a degree, as it moves back and forth between the Matrix and the real world, or a lesser science fiction film of 1998, The 13th Floor, which moves across 3 different worlds. Each one is lit differently, and the costume is slightly different in each one. But when there's much more dramatic costume changes, then yeah, that puts significant pressure on the production designer. Though, generally, Historical dramas, even set and most often set in a single historical era prior to now, are pure Oscar bait, because the emphasis on creating a 18th century French ballroom, arena with formal gowns for women and dress for men, that's more difficult in a sense than dressing up figures in a contemporary film like Inception. So it's rare when a film set in a contemporary environment beats out a historical drama in costuming. All right, next question from Caitlin. When comparing angles, storyline, and the other information available, a short film would seem to be lacking in these departments due to the limited time. However, why do they always seem to have more quality content than most movies? Of course, this may be my bias to short films, but I still feel like there might be some relevant consequences here, besides the typical, it keeps you interested due to its fast pace. Caitlin, this is really a matter of personal preference, and I'll turn to the sort of prior forms of the short story and the novel. I don't really get short stories. I like them, but I don't really understand how they work, and a lot of times I just don't get them. Whereas the novel, I have a really clear understanding of how it works, how it operates. And so with short films are like a punch. And they often they build to the delivery of a single ringing note. And I think Cargo does that exquisitely well. Many of you, I think, agreed based on the class discussion. So what happens is of course, I could complain about you millennials with your short attention span theater, but that would be false, given that I've already pointed out, I believe, that I think commercials are among the best avant-garde filmmaking. So it may just be the purity, the sort of crystal clarity of that single punch, that single note that many effective short films attempt to strike. Whereas the longer film, like the novel, with more characters, a more clustered milieu, more things happening, it's trying to do lots of things. And often a short film is trying to do one thing. And it's easier to do one thing well, perhaps, than to execute the many, many things that a feature-length film is attempting to do, especially when short films are often made by a very small crew. A short film that I'm aware of was directed by an individual, and there was a camera person, and there were 2 actors, and that was it. And so they are more likely, perhaps, to share a common vision than a film like Avatar, which features 1,000 or more people working on it, whether behind the scenes or whether mapping their movement onto the animated characters, or whether working in the computer rendering of the graphics. Next question from Olivia. What is the difference between the first and second wave of blaxploitation movies? Well, the first wave of blaxploitation starts with Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. And this is a film from Mario Van Peebles Sr. It's an independent film. It was produced in part through money that was given by several black celebrities of the time, including Bill Cosby. The film was rated X and features the misadventures of a young black man who grows up in a brothel and becomes involved in the sex industry, and his body and sexuality is exploited by white suburban audiences, and the film ends with him fleeing. It was rated X. The blaxploitation genre became more broadly popular with the release of Shaft. But that film Shaft, the black detective, the film is called Shaft. There's a pretty obvious reference to the phallus there and the mythical premise of the more well-endowed African-American men and their more prominent sexuality as well as physical strength. But Shaft features this black man as a hero and working both in and outside the law. Now, the success of Shaft, a film directed by a black man featuring a black man, still catering to African-American stereotypes, yet empowering black people insofar as for the first time, really, in a popular film, black audiences could go and see themselves on the screen playing major roles, being heroes, instead of being secondary figures who were invariably servants, most of the time. This launched a series of films, and indeed Pam Grier's career, films like Coffee, Black Cleopatra, films that glorified pimping. And these African American characters were often the good character, the protagonist, but working outside the law. There was a lull in films prominently representing African Americans into the late 1970s and into the 1980s, but the little-known film House Party, starring Kid and Play, released by New Line Cinema, cost, I believe, about $3 million to make, and it made $24 million in distribution and exhibition. So that demonstrated the viability of films prominently featuring black men and women. At the same time, it now, given the popularity of hip-hop, linked black film to popular black music, such as it is. And this we can then see in films, less the music component, well, actually, yeah, with the music component, in Mario Van Peebles Jr.'s film New Jack City, which stars Ice-T. Next, we see it in John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, and then films like Juice, films like Belly, which would prominently feature well-known African-American rappers like Tupac et al. So we see one generic cycle from 1971 into the mid-late 70s, and another really beginning in 1991 and extending through 2005. Next, from Kendra, mise-en-scène is obviously a pretty broad spectrum of film elements. How do you propose that we, the audience, effectively pick up on all the hidden nuances created with mise-en-scène? I've got a short answer here and a long answer. The short answer is hit pause a lot. I'll often, watching a film, hit pause and pay close attention to the lighting, the simulated depth, the composition of objects within the frame, the color, as many elements as I can code, and then play, and then pause again. And one thing we can gain from this is the recognition of patterns. At the opening of 25th Hour, not the very opening, the sort of prelim, but as Monty is sitting looking over the East River, and then he goes for a walk and he walks to the school, the shots alternate between very flat two-dimensional shots and shots that emphasize perspectival lines and a seaming 3 dimensions projected onto the two-dimensional screen. And that alternation between 2D and 3D is eye-catching. So it's by hitting pause and by looking for relationships between shots and contrasts between them that we can gain a better understanding of what's happening with lighting, with where objects are placed within the frame with respect to another, both left to right, top to bottom, and front to back in the 3D space. We can pay attention to how the lighting casts shadows in some areas and no shadows in other areas. We can pay attention to the seeming proximity to the subject. Extreme long shot, medium shot, close-up, extreme close-up. So it's really by hitting pause and using all of our film vocabulary that we can notice all of this. The one thing you can't note, I'll also add high angle, eye level, low angle, bird's eye view, worm's eye view. Bird's eye view looking straight down, worm's eye view looking straight up. But one thing you can't see of mise-en-scène and hitting pause is camera movement. So then remember to, in the single shot, hit play, and after you've paid attention to the static elements in the paused image, pay attention to the movement of the camera through space. Tyler says, the production designer seems to be a major part in the making of the movie, yet is overshadowed by the director. Do you feel that the production designers don't get enough credit as they should? Tyler, it kind of depends on the film. Though, I take that back. It doesn't. I would suggest that the 3 key figures behind the scenes who we never recognize, never know, but who contribute so much to the movie are the production designer, the editor, and the sound editor. Because when we see a movie, we can note acting, of course. We can note writing. Directing is a little tougher. It's hard to know it's hard to tell the difference between an actor's performance and the degree to which the director coaxed out that actor's performance. It's also easy to substitute the director's work for the editor's work and see the composition of the shots as the work of the of the director rather than the editor. Often, though, however, editors and directors work in very close tandem. The production designer, though, makes the world the shot shows. And whether this is, and again, I'm going to turn to historical dramas here, which, like costumes, showcase production spaces. So I'm thinking here to go all the way back to the Russian Ark, that 10-minute sequence where we move through the ballroom and there's the characters, and that all has to be designed. Recall that virtually every film starts with a blank slate, and that every room is created in Monty's apartment when the DEA shows up. That's a set, or it is a location scouted, which is then stripped down and then built up. One way we can tell this is the poster behind Monty on the wall of his condo is from Cool Hand Luke, right? The 1967 film about a convicted felon who won't respect authority. So production designers' work can be seemingly invisible until we study film, until we hit pause and look at the composition of the objects and the world they create, and recognize the degree to which it wasn't just the director or the writer, but the production designer who designed that world. But again, part of the issue here comes in terms of subordination and leadership. Production designers work in close coordination at the direction of the director. They attempt to manifest the director's vision. But just because you're told to do something doesn't mean you can do it. So the artistry in executing that vision is extraordinary. Stanley Kubrick, I doubt, could design interior spaces with the success of an expert production designer, though he was perhaps a poor choice, since Stanley Kubrick and Ridley Scott both have backgrounds as graphic artists, so scratch that. Let's substitute David Fincher instead. Next question from William D. I'm still a little unsure about this, but in the wife zombie comes alive scene in Cargo, what is that shot from behind the zombie to the husband who is struggling? And second, is it still considered a two-shot with both bodies in the scene? And I think here William is referring to the incomplete representation of the zombie wife. It's a beautiful opening sequence, not just a single shot, but that opening montage of blurred images. And what's really happening here is it's not all a first-person point of view shot. What we see when it's blurry, we're not necessarily looking out of the husband's eyes, because one time we see his face and he's blurry. This is what Bruce Cowan, in How Movies Work, calls a mind screen, where what we see on the screen is filtered through the consciousness of a character, but it's not necessarily from the direct point of view of that character's eyes. It's not just the mise-en-scène, it's blurriness that conveys to the audience the disorientation of our protagonist. It's also the rapid cutting, that the character emerging from unconsciousness is disoriented, is attempting to find out where he is, just as we are trying to find out who and where he is. Now there's that great shot from behind her as we see his terror, because initially with the blurriness we see that it's probably a woman, but we don't see that she's a zombie. So once his vision clarifies enough and we can see that she's attacking him, the shot from behind shows him in this position of great vulnerability. There's no particular name for that shot, though I think the question, is it a one-shot or a two-shot, is a tough one. I think I would go ahead and call it a one-shot, because even though the woman is partially visible, I believe on the right side of the screen, she's blurred so that we emphasize the male character. Now, we can see the same thing in many conversation scenes. So if the conventional setup for two characters speaking to one another, maybe seating in chairs, looking at one another, this would be in like Frost Nixon in the interrogation scene of The Matrix, where they're sitting across from one another. First, you do the establishing shot showing the two of them where they are in relationship with one another. Then, in shooting the character who's speaking or reacting to the speaker, you shoot over the shoulder. So if we have character A, who is the object of the shot, we're focused on their speaking or their reaction, character B may appear on the right side of the screen, partially blurred out so we know where to focus. Then it cuts and we're shooting from over the shoulder of character A, and we see character B and we focus on their face, their either reaction or their speaking. This is pretty standard. It's occasionally departed from, and in one relatively famous case, it's departed from in Jonathan Demme's 1991 Silence of the Lambs. He frequently has two characters speaking to one another, but instead of shooting over the shoulder of one character and seeing the other character looking into the eyes slightly to our left, instead he shoots directly at the character's face with them looking straight into our eyes. This is disconcerting when those characters are Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, and Anthony Hopkins' Dr. Lecter. At other times, it's intense but possibly reassuring, as when Clarice Starling and her fellow FBI trainee deduce why the congressperson is referring over and over in a TV news clip to the name of her daughter, to humanize the daughter so that Buffalo Bill won't kill her. All right, personal question here. Chris, what genre do you find best to watch? I've been waiting for one of these questions. Somebody who just goes off, the course content is just kind of curious what movies I like. Now, of course, when he says best to watch, he may, I suppose, mean, what genre is the best. That's obviously a matter of taste. So I'm going to take it that he's asking me what my favorite genre is. And historically, my favorite genre is science fiction. I was 5 when Star Wars came out. I was one of the families who stood in line, or my dad stood in line, and the rest of the family sat in our VW bus. And we waited for over an hour and a half, and I sat there enraptured and watched it. And that movie pretty much, or rather the next one, Empire Strikes Back, effectively babysat my brother and I as we would walk down the street, get on the bus, go downtown, switch to another bus, go to the theater on McHenry Avenue. And incidentally, McHenry Avenue is the location of cruising, cars driving back and forth. That's the basis for George Lucas's American Graffiti, because he grew up in Modesto as I did. And I would sit there and watch the movie, sit there while the ushers swept the theater, and then sit and watch it again. Last time I tried to count it up, I'd seen Empire Strikes Back over 40 times. I've seen Star Wars over 40 times. So I'm kind of a junkie. That's how I started. Now, since then, my tastes have changed. I still love science fiction film, and The Matrix is one of my all-time favorite movies. I'm one of 15 people who thinks The Matrix 2 and 3 are good. But my interests have shifted a little bit to the action film, and I really loved Lethal Weapon and a series of kind of set in the present, hard drive, detective-oriented, tough guy movies. I realize the premise of Taken is ridiculous, but it's still really fun to watch. And I remember watching it in the theater with Ray Murlock, my fellow film professor. We might have seen Taken 2, I don't remember. And even though we knew exactly what was going to happen throughout the entire movie, I could feel my pulse rate quickening. So we might even add the action film to one of the body genres. Of course, we can also see in Taken the play out of the crime film icon and syntactic structure as a genre. So Liam Neeson, the mob, and his daughter. Avenger, criminal, victim. And Liam Neeson, we're offered, is effectively victim by proxy because he's hurt by his daughter's capture. He then proceeds to kill, over 40 people in Eastern Europe to get his daughter back, to protect her virginity, which is pretty clearly established that's the purpose. So apparently it takes 40 Eastern Europeans to equal the virginity of one young white girl in a scheme of American action film. Of course, in conducting his revenge, he commits a whole series of crimes. Most notably, of course, when he shoots the guy in France, or shoots the wife of the guy in France. So he is a proxy victim, he becomes an avenger, and thereby becomes a criminal. But for me, it's the really brutal action films that operate outside the scope of PG-13 and recognize that violence is not fun, it's brutal and painful. But it's still really fun to watch. And so for me, the Indonesian film Raid Redemption from 2011, John Wick 1 and 2, I just think they're great films. They're fun. Um, they have greater, deeper meaning, but they're mostly superficial and splashy. I don't like action films that blend action with humor. So Jackie Chan's dead to me, but I think Bruce Lee's awesome. These, of course, are entirely matters of taste. I'll happily regale you with why I think Blade 2 has a deeper meaning with regard to transformations in Europe, or how the opening sequence of John Wick 2 is incredibly important because it shifts the attention from, oh, we think he's after his car, to, no, he's after a gosh darn birthday card that he got from his wife now dead, and he wanted the birthday card back. So, no real spoilering. Come on, it's a birthday card. So, that's my favorite genre. One thing, I'm going to push this a little further, and this notion of best film. So, the Academy Awards regularly nominates films for Best Picture. And recently we saw films like Moonlight and La La Land competing. Wildly different genres. A musical, a drama spanning the 2 decades of a character's life and his transformations, and many, many, many others. So it seems as if Best Picture should be genreless and evaluate a film based on its excellence. Well, first off, direction, acting, and writing are often lesser predictors of a film being nominated for or winning Best Picture than editing and sound editing. Because those are the things that make a picture great that we don't immediately recognize, or at least we don't as general audiences, but experts do. Another thing is between 1980 and 2005, there was a tendency of Best Picture nominees and winners to be historical epics set in a time prior to now that had a grand scope. There were massive consequences to the actions of the characters on the screen. They featured ensemble casts. The main character would often die at the end, but would be redeemed in some fashion in redeeming the larger society and culture. Films like Chariots of Fire, films like to Braveheart. Indeed, we could see Gladiator as Ridley Scott's effort to say, screw it, I know that Alien and Blade Runner are my masterpieces, but I want to win a Best Picture, so I'm going to direct Gladiator. You can see Martin Scorsese's The Aviator attempting to sort of traffic in that same realm. Yet after 9/11, there was a greater sense in the immediacy of now in the selection of Best Picture nominees and winners. So this notion of a Best Picture is genreless. We could instead say there's a genre of Best Picture, though that genre shifts as history and culture shift and our set of concerns changes. We can see Moonlight in some way, it's winning. It's a fantastic film, it's gorgeous, wonderful. We can also see it as a response to the previous 2 years' Oscars so white critique that often progressive liberal Hollywood nevertheless manages to nominate a whole lot of white people for all the awards. All right, that wraps up our mailbag for today. We've got a great week this week. I'm really excited about our course content, really excited about the revision of your scene description and analyses. The one thing you'll note with the quizzes this week is they're shifting a little bit away from the multiple choice, and we're shifting more to short and longer answer questions that will ask you to draw comparisons between the film and the course concepts. This is to prepare you for the final exam. The sorts of questions asked in the next quizzes are precisely the sort of questions that I will ask in the final exam, with the exception that the final exam will also include 2 other important sorts of questions. One, an essay question, a prompt for 3 paragraphs or more. And another, I will feature questions that show a film still, and you'll need to identify what film it is, who directed it, what year it came out, and when in the film this scene appears. It sounds hard. It's not going to be that hard. All right, have a great week. Let's watch our movies. And while I don't think I can show you anything else as good as Cargo based on your responses, I'll try. Bye.